I want to talk a little bit about seasonal movements of fish and specifically how the mapping factor really figures into your strategy when you're out there fishing. And you know, this is a critical concept when we talk about seasonal movements of fish as it applies to walleyes. But we're going to talk about this in a way that's general enough that it applies to all species, especially predator species, because there's definitely a seasonal pattern of movement from the shallows in the early spring portions of the year, maybe some mid-lake offshore type structure in the summertime, all the way out to basin relating fish into the dog days of July, August, and beyond, as well as a movement back into the shallows again. So when we're talking about mapping and specifically figuring out what areas to fish, so if you're talking early season walleyes, we're thinking shallow. And first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna set up our depth highlight. As you can see right here, everything in green is 12 foot of water, shallower, and we're thinking shoreline structure. We're thinking about big main lake points like you see here. And a lot of the associated structure immediately off of it that's also shallow. Again, less than 12 feet really highlights those areas that we want to key in on, and that may be these big main lake points. It may be even some rocks and small rock piles in isolated areas, but it's also going to show those great nursery areas for bait, you know, these big flats that come off of those areas. So spring and early season walleye fishing is all about 12 foot and shallower, and that depth highlight feature really shows it well. But moving on from there, the next move is going to help us figure out where we're going to be catching fish after that period. And when we depth highlight those areas in 20 feet of water, maybe 10 to 20 or 12 foot to 20, that's the next move to offshore. On some lakes that may be as deep as 25 feet of water. So now we're getting out of June and maybe working late June and into July, and those fish are definitely moving offshore. You know, earlier we were focusing on all these shallow water spots, but as summer starts to kick in, you see I've highlighted that 15 to 25 foot range, and it really gives your mind's eye so much more to look at, because we're starting to talk about these secondary humps, these pieces of offshore structure throughout the lake that these fish are moving and migrating out to en masse. Now, you're always going to have some shallow fish, some deep fish, but the idea is that when we depth highlight this range during this part of the season, that's where most of the fish of the lake are going to be, and it's where we're going to be able to most effectively target them. Now we start talking about moving into deep summer. Well, we've got the offshore stuff that's out in basins. Now, basins are totally different because, again, the substrate is different. We're typically talking deep mud, and walleyes are relating to bait fish that are out there suspended over the deep mud. And so many different things are happening now in this basin section of the lake. And if you look right now, I've got my depth highlight in 27 to 37 feet of water. And that's really important because, especially when we're talking about basin fish, we're thinking about trolling, right? And so this really helps define a constricted section of the lake where we need to focus all of our efforts. And using depth highlight to your advantage for the seasonal movements there is super important. Whether we're talking deep basins, whether we're talking offshore structure, or whether we're talking in the spring and the fall, some of the shallow shoreline portions in 12 feet of water or less. So use that to your advantage, learn more about the lake and its substrate because of it, and use those shapes that are highlighted to help you catch more fish.